At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Australia's war dead honoured in Anzac Day services.
Let us dedicate ourselves to the service of the ideals for which they died.
The Prime Minister pays an unannounced visit to troops in Afghanistan and Iraq.
I'm here as your Prime Minister to thank you for your service.
And North Korea celebrates a military milestone with a major live fire exercise.
North Korea is a big world problem.
This is SBS World News with Janice Peterson.
Good evening. It was the disastrous campaign that helped establish a fledgling country. Gallipoli, 8 months of fighting, 11,000 Australian and New Zealand soldiers killed. And today, 102 years after the first men, boys really, fell on the beaches of Turkey, their sacrifice was again honoured. At Anzac ceremonies across the country, the words rang out, "We will remember them."
It's the call that connects Australia's history to the present. 38,000 stood in solemn silence at the War Memorial in Canberra as stories of fallen soldiers were shared.
Each name reminds us to look beyond the broad brushstrokes of history to remind and remember the individual sacrifices made in our name.
The rain adding to the sombre feeling for the 30,000 at Melbourne's dawn service, honouring our servicemen and women.
And no matter their fate, their effort to find a value we now simply call Anzac.
It was a message heard in all corners of the country.
The key tenet of the day is that we remember.
102 years after Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli, Sydney's beaches were today used as a fitting backdrop.
It's really inspiring, I think, to see how the public are reacting.
And as the sun rose over the Gold Coast, a modern classic rang out.
Hey, true blue.
The significant contribution of Indigenous soldiers was not ignored. For the first time, Aboriginal veterans led Canberra's commemoration march. And as the light shone brighter, the crowds became bigger.
While today is a day of reflection and remembrance, for many of those marching, it's also a day of pride and a celebration of the Australian spirit.
This is in memory of all the people, not only who died, but who got disabled, dismembered, and who did come back but never lived again properly.
Today's the day, you know, and it's obvious to me that people appreciate what we did.
Miss you, mate! From the collared to the colourful, people came out to show their support, some paying tribute to loved ones, others just wanted to say thank you.
We wouldn't know what they went through, so yeah, we just wanted to say thank you.
To see the spirit, it's really enjoyable. Yeah.
And watch our son, he's marching in the school band.
After the commemorations, it was time for another Anzac Day tradition, a game of two-up, an experience shared by diggers both during and after their service. For some, a chance to reflect on the values so many fought and died for.
We're pretty lucky in this country to enjoy a really happy and free lifestyle, and it's important to remember that that didn't come without cost.
A legacy that lives on today. Brianna Roberts, SBS World News.
SBS reporter Miles Morgan is outside the War Memorial in Canberra. Miles, the dawn service is usually well attended by politicians, but not today.
No, Janice, political commemoration, Anzac Day commemorations in Canberra rather, are usually a day for political solidarity, but there was barely a politician in the capital today. The opposition leader travelled to Papua New Guinea. The Prime Minister made a secret visit to Iraq and Afghanistan. Malcolm Turnbull met with regional leaders and hinted at an extended military commitment in the Middle East.
Touching down in Afghanistan, Malcolm Turnbull meets the soldiers serving in Australia's longest war.
I'm here as your Prime Minister to thank you for your service.
and also to meet some of the country's most important leaders, including Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and the government's Chief Executive Officer, Abdullah Abdullah.
Good to see you again.
More than 200 Australian soldiers are mentoring the Afghan military with coalition partners. The American Defence Secretary James Mattis also spoke with the Prime Minister about how to rebuild the country. On his way to Afghanistan, Mr Turnbull stopped in Iraq, where he received a ceremonial welcome from New Zealand soldiers. There he presented medals to Australian Special Forces, who were advising the Iraqi army on how to fight IS.
It's a global battle, and we are fighting with the same allies we fought with 100 years ago, but in a different fight. So good to see you again.
Meeting Iraq's Prime Minister, he announced an immediate donation of $10 million to the Iraqi government to help with its liberation of Mosul from IS, and another $100 million over the next 3 years.
You are helping the forces of Iraq defend themselves and liberate their country from Daesh.
Australia's missions in Iraq and Afghanistan have been almost continuous since 2001. It's cost 44 Australian lives, and the Prime Minister says the missions may be extended, taking military commitments to nearly 20 years.
It is going to be a long-term commitment, and we will consider with our allies in these conflict area, we will consider requests for further support.
On the shores of Gallipoli, where the Anzac tradition began, the flags of former enemies flew side by side. The Turkish paid tribute to the 8,000 Australians who died there in World War I in what they call the Battle of Çanakkale.
Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well.
A terrible loss was endured. An extraordinary legend was born.
On the other side of the world, hundreds paid their respects at row after row of Australian graves in Papua New Guinea. The peaceful hills masking a murderous history of fighting along the Kokoda Track against the Japanese in World War II.
Outnumbered, outgunned and outflanked, our diggers dug in, holding on, buying time, stalling the Japanese advance.
It reminds Australia that we can never take our peace and liberty and freedom for granted.
The flags raised by the young to remember the old and those who never came back. Miles Morgan, SBS World News.
SBS Europe correspondent Brett Mason is in Villers-Bretonneux in northern France, the scene of another famous battle. So, Brett, the fields around you are the final resting place for many Australians.
Well, Janice, it is here on the Western Front where 45,000 young Australians lost their lives during World War I. 1917, 100 years ago, remains the darkest and bloodiest chapter in Australia's military history. More Australian troops lost their lives in that year than any other year in Australian history. And today, hundreds who gathered here to remember those lost lives were told that young hopes, dreams and lives were churned into mud, blood and death.
The sound of Indigenous Australia rings out on the other side of the world. At a place deeply etched in our history, listed at this memorial in Villers-Bretonneux, the names of almost 11,000 soldiers with no known grave.
They rest in peace, while over them all, Australia's tower keeps watch and ward.
100 years ago, these parts were the scene of brutality and horror, but also of great mateship and strength.
In 1917, the Western Front saw Australian lives, hopes and dreams churned into mud, blood and death.
Next year marks the century of the Great Western Front battle, as Australians fought tooth and nail to help reclaim the village of Villers-Bretonneux. It was a turning point in history.
France and Australia stand alongside one another as true friends in this place, an emblem of comradeship.
This morning, recognition not just for those who fought on the ground, but also those in the air, their number fewer than 3,000. a reminder that in the history book of loss and sacrifice, there are so many chapters.
We pause at this dawn to reflect and to remember before you, eternal God, the tragedy of the battles that occurred around this sacred memorial.
We will remember them, lest we forget.
And then, as a new day dawned, silence. Wreaths were laid and respects paid. Security was tight for this ceremony, with a close eye cast over the 2,000 people who attended.
While concerns about security and terrorism have seen fewer Australians make the Anzac pilgrimage here to France, organisers say they're confident these seats will be full next year for the 100th anniversary.
It will be incredibly important next year as we celebrate or commemorate the centenary, that as many people come as possible.
At Villebretoneur, Brett Mason, SBS World News.
And we will have more on Anzac Day a little later, including a look at those who risked everything to help Australia's soldiers in our longest ever war. The entire US Senate is being called to the White House for a briefing on North Korea tomorrow, as Donald Trump tells the United Nations to impose new sanctions on the country. North Korea today conducted what's believed to be its largest ever live-fire artillery exercises to mark the 85th anniversary of the foundation of its army.
A massive indoor rally. Pyongyang's top commanders and political leaders cheer in support. 85 years on since the Korean People's Army was founded. Outside, floral tributes for the country's founder and his son.
Our great leaders founded and wisely led our revolutionary army. And just like that, now our respected Marshal Kim Jong-un is leading wisely. So even though the situation is tense, we are celebrating the day.
Groups of people taking to the streets to dance. Celebrations also including a massive live fire drill. Fearing the anniversary could be marked with a missile launch or a sixth nuclear test, Donald Trump called a White House meeting with the UN Security Council, calling the situation with North Korea unacceptable.
And the Council must be prepared to impose additional and stronger sanctions on North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile programs. This is a real threat to the world, whether we want to talk about it or not. North Korea is a big world problem.
Behind the Trump administration's sudden urgency, according to the New York Times, appears to be a growing body of classified intelligence reports, concluding the country is capable of producing a nuclear bomb every 6 or 7 weeks. In an unusual move, Mr. Trump has invited the entire Senate, as well as the State and Defence Secretaries, to the White House for a briefing tomorrow. It follows a phone call between Mr. Trump and the Chinese president, where Xi Jinping called for restraint from all sides.
As two influential countries in the world, maintaining close communication between the leaders of China and the US and exchanging views on issues of common concerns in a timely manner could be beneficial for the two countries and beneficial for the international community.
With threats to sink American aircraft carrier the USS Carl Vinson, which is beginning joint drills with 2 Japanese destroyers in the Western Pacific Ocean, the USS Michigan, a guided missile submarine, is currently making a visible port call in South Korea as a show of force. In Tokyo, Japanese, US and South Korean high-level officials have met to discuss ways to gain cooperation from both China and Russia. A special UN Security Council meeting on North Korea will be held in New York on Friday. Kirsty Johansson, SBS World News.
We have more news from North Korea shortly. We talk to a man who crossed the mine-riddled border to search for love. Also, the modern-day battlefield where rebels fight regimes and militants. But next, Marine Le Pen steps down to improve her presidential position.